With the last video, we looked at the political atmosphere of these years from 1964 to 82. Essentially, part of that is to help provide you with some context for the things we'll be discussing in this video, looking at economic policies. And we have basically two learning outcomes. Understand the main features of the Soviet economy under Brezhnev and assess the reasons for such. And because I can't count, look at, compare and contrast it with the economic policies under Khrushchev. Real existing socialism, quote unquote. All right. One of the things that we already know about the Brezhnev regime is that there is no ideological basis. And as we said before, that therefore, the legitimacy of the government is going to be grounded in military strength. And we'll see a lot of investment within the military for that reason. They essentially have no real ideological belief anymore. Therefore, they toned down the rhetoric. So the propaganda was no longer discussing the awesomeness of the Soviet system, the amazingness of the Soviet economy, and previously there were always projections as to when the Soviet Union would surpass the West in the production of X. Now there's no longer that because they're not trying to achieve that anymore. They're maintaining stability. And so what instead they said was that, you guys, maybe you didn't recognize it, but what we have here is real existing socialism. The idea is that socialism had arrived. There's no need to strive for more. Socialism has arrived. And then one of the things that you remember, I am sure, is that socialism was the step to get to communism. So in a way, the propaganda was also there to maintain the status quo and to try to keep people from asking questions. Here's some historiography. Keynes said that the 18-year-long Brezhnev era was full of paradoxes. It was a time when the Soviet Union achieved its greatest international success. It became a world power, second to none, but it was also a time of wasted opportunities. A time when the country's economic decline, now seemingly inevitable, commenced. It was a period of much desired stability and tranquility. In light of subsequent developments, Brezhnev's era came to be described as a time of stagnation, yet most people in Russia today look back on it with nostalgia. And so let's talk about the economic policies. First, we'll give a broad overview, then look at some more specific things that were done. So in looking at the Soviet system, one of the things that we kind of have to recognize, and this goes for over the whole period of Russian history, is that the promise of communism is connected to the well-being of the economy. So one of the ways that communism was sold to people, that they're able to get support and to keep in power, is by basically keep promising people that the economy is going to improve. And through the improvement in the economy, then people's lives will also improve. And so there's this belief in the superiority of central planning that is an integral aspect of communism, that you're going to get rid of those capitalist elements, which creates inequality and injustice, and instead have centralized planning. But the thing with central planning, and this is where you kind of have the guns versus butter versus some other stuff debate, right? Is, of course, the butter is about improving the lives of the people, and this is what people understand, this is what people want. But at the same time, because of the Cold War, they need to satisfy the needs of the military. Now, partly it is because they are fighting the Cold War, but also because the military itself is such a important aspect politically, that the needs of the military needs to be satisfied. And then because of the Cold War and because of the foreign policy implemented by Brezhnev, there must also be investment outside of the country. So in a way, it was this sort of tripartite thingy-majiggy that they tried to balance. And this was achievable-ish when the economy was simpler. Stalin seemed to be able to meet all of those needs, but also keep in mind that Stalin didn't get involved quite as heavily in foreign policy. His foreign policy was quite conservative. But as the economy expands, and part of this is because of the earlier successes of the system, the economy expands, it has a lot more moving parts, and it becomes more and more difficult. It's kind of like imagining the difference between maintaining a bicycle with its moving parts and maintaining a car. You know, you could conceivably learn enough to take care of your bicycle, but in today's world, in today's cars, with all of the thingamajobbies and stuff happening inside, it is incredibly difficult. All right, so overall, when we look at the Soviet system, one of the biggest problems was that the people at the top could not admit, because to do so would undermine the legitimacy of their government and their power and the special privileges that they enjoyed, or they could not recognize, mainly because this was all that they knew and they couldn't see outside of the system. So people could not admit and or recognize the problems within the system were structural. To try to fix those problems would be to completely dismantle the system that's in place and rebuild something new. So what they did was they tinkered and they tinkered, trying to fix things, never quite solving anything, until you get to Gorbachev, who tinkers to the point that the system pretty much collapses. So in the Brezhnevian era, you do not have a complete break with Khrushchev. Some of the things that Khrushchev did were good, and so they couldn't roll those back. But the things that Khrushchev did that undermined the power of the people at the top, those are the things that they hurriedly fixed or changed or rolled back. So instead, what you have in this time period is incremental change. So small changes, which ultimately don't respond to the needs of the system enough, but there's also increased investment domestically within the economy. Now, again, this is an overall view, but this also goes to discuss sort of the vulnerabilities in some way of the economy at this time. So in 1973, there was an oil crisis in which OPEC dramatically decreased production in response to the US's involvement in the Yom Kippur War. Now, as we know, the Soviet Union was often involved in Middle Eastern stuff, but what this oil crisis did was, I think it quadrupled the oil prices. And during the Khrushchev time, the Soviet Union had worked to develop investment in her mineral resources, and she has oil. What this does is this is a great benefit for the Soviet Union at this time, because now they have hard currency. They have a currency that is readily tradable on the international market because oil is sold in dollars. But at this time, they're flush. But there's still a juggling act with the monies that are available. What this ultimately means, though, is at this time period when the oil crisis is happening and they're flush, great, they have money to invest in things. But when oil prices go down again, the economy is not robust enough to be able to deal with that. So overall, during this time, you do have improved output in the various sectors of the economy. Not always improved quality, but yes, there's improved output. And we also have increased standard of living. But what that means is now that people have more money, people have greater demand for food. We'll look at the living standards a little bit in greater detail later on. And what this also then means is that there will be increased increased imports, maybe 2 airports, but definitely increased imports, as the domestic economy is not able to meet the demand. Kosygin was in charge of the economy, and we'll spend some time later on looking more specifically at his attempts at reform. But over this period of time, the pace of growth slowed. And there is a widening gap between the Soviet Union and the West, that is, the growth that has occurred in Western Europe and the US and Canada, as well as Southeast Asia. So you have this massive explosion of growth in places like South Korea and Japan, Australia. And so this gap is increasing, and the goals that the Soviet Union had said that she was going to achieve. And the overall reason for this is because the Soviet Union couldn't make the switch from extensive to intensive growth. That is, a whole lot of stuff was developed, both within the industrial sector and also within the agricultural sector. However, the resources were not used as intensively as they could, so and they weren't used as efficiently or effectively as they could. So the yields weren't as great as they should have been. The industrial output isn't as much as it should have been, especially given the amount of investment. And ultimately, what you see happening at this time is decreased birth rates in European Russia, idle hands in factories. People are guaranteed to get paid. There is no reason for them to work hard. And also a lack of technological advancement. Ultimately, one of the things that happens is there's this attempt, this is part of the tinkering, to introduce independence to factory managers, but the planning still remained in Moscow. So again, you still have people not knowing the local conditions, not being able to respond to supply and demand, making the decisions. And this whole entire system encouraged or the discouragement of innovation. So basically, the whole system was about maintaining the status quo. And because the Soviet Union wasn't being innovative anymore, then they start falling behind economically. And we will stop here for now, and make sure you watch the next one, which will discuss industry and all kinds of fun stuff. Laters.